Welcome to the presentation of the fifth chapter of our new principles of economics.
In this lecture, we will focus on the topic of specialization and cooperation. We build on one key insight from the previous chapter. Humans have evolved as an ultra-social species that excels in cooperation. So we will explore the concept of the division of labor in groups that cooperate. When people specialize, they need to exchange their products. This exchange can be forced or voluntary, with markets being the most important form of the latter. Specialization involves issues of unequal power and strategic interaction between the parties, leading to what we regard as a corollary to the famous invisible hand theorem, namely the specialization dilemma. We will examine this and related dilemmas in more detail using simple but canonical models of game theory. Finally, we will discuss the issue of externalities and the related criteria of efficiency of cooperation.
Let us start with some basics on human cooperation and specialization. It is important to view markets as a form of cooperation rather than just emphasizing competition. In our view, markets are like a sports league. Teams compete, but they also cooperate in setting up the terms of competition. As a result, they create entertainment for themselves and the audience. By a similar combination of competition and cooperation, well-designed markets contribute to the welfare of the community.
Human groups cooperate through a flexible division of labor, which can take various institutional and organizational forms. When individuals specialize, they can increase their productivity. This also allows for the creation of new production methods that would be impossible to achieve alone. In human evolution, the prime example is group hunting. An individual hunter may be strong enough to slay the prey, but he may not be capable to organize the hunt and the utilization of the meat and other resources in the most efficient way. In the context of competition among groups, that is, group selection, the division of labor is favored over non-cooperative regimes.
The division of labor is a fundamental principle in economics, based on the concept of comparative advantage. This principle suggests that individuals or groups within a society should specialize in tasks that they can do most efficiently compared to others. By specializing in specific tasks, individuals or groups can increase overall productivity and efficiency, leading to greater economic output and prosperity.
Isn't that the principle that was popularized by the economist David Ricardo and has had a significant impact on international trade theory and economic policy?
Correct. But it is important to recognize that the principle applies universally. That is because it is based on the logic of opportunity cost, which, as we have seen, transcends the economic sphere. Even if someone is better at various activities, this actor should specialize in what it can do with the least cost compared to the next best alternative. The cost is just giving up that alternative. Ricardo took national economies as an example. But we can generalize, for example, to the case of a division of labor between individuals. Someone may be highly skilled in both crafts and farming, but should still specialize in crafts if someone else is relatively better at farming compared to crafts. As a result, the artisan and the farmer specialize and exchange their products, leading to a higher level of productivity for both.
How can we assess gains from exchange? Voluntary exchange may indicate that everyone benefits compared to non-cooperation, corresponding to what economists call the Pareto principle. Fulfillment of the Pareto criterion indicates an efficient result, with market allocation being the most important example. Importantly, however, this does not guarantee equal distribution of gains. We will return to these points later in this lecture.
Forced exchange, in contrast, can imply a violation of the Pareto principle. For example, the craftsperson may compel the farmer to specialize by producing weapons and threatening him to surrender more products. Here, one person loses out in forced exchange, perhaps even more than in comparison with the status quo.
We see that the topic of gains from exchange and specialization is significantly wider than the standard economic perspective, which mostly focuses on Pareto optimality and the increase output only. A fundamental counterpart of the classical gains from specialization perspective is the specialization dilemma. It was suggested by economist James Buchanan, drawing on the story of Robinson Crusoe and Friday meeting on the lonely island where Robinson has stranded. Imagine that Robinson and Friday establish an agreement to specialize. Robinson as a craftsman, Friday as a farmer. They then part ways, each working on their part of the island in peace. However, if Robinson cheats and continues with farming because he's good in both farming and craftsmanship, Friday will become dependent on him since he has no ability for craftsmanship by himself. As a consequence, Robinson is now in a position to appropriate a larger share of the gains from cooperation.
And of course, if Friday does not trust Robinson, he will do the same.
Specialization can be affected by relative power dynamics between different parties. This is evident in situations where individuals are required to cultivate specific competencies that are tailor-made for a particular collaborative environment and are not easily transferable to other contexts. For example, employees may be required to dedicate time and resources to acquiring training and skills that are highly specific to their roles within a particular organization. They may hesitate to make these investments if they believe that the acquired expertise will have limited applicability elsewhere.
This is one example for the role of asset specificity related to the specialization dilemma. Asset specificity can have different dimensions. There is an important temporal dimension which may be exacerbated by mismatches between supply and demand. Think of the oversupply of certain qualifications on the labor market as a result of past investment decisions on the labor supply side. The temporal dimension also refers to the acquisition of dynamic capabilities to change qualifications or output over time. Think of the loss of mental flexibility that employees may develop as a consequence of decade-long monotonous and undemanding work, or of adapting to product developments as a consequence of investing into certain production technologies. Special asset specificity may play a role when, for example, a producer in a supply chain locates closely to its main customer. A similar logic applies to relational asset specificity. Think of a real estate agent investing in building up a social network. All these decisions have a bearing on the development of comparative advantage and the specialization dilemma over time.
Let us now turn to cooperation as a form of strategic interaction. Economists often use game theory to analyze such interactions. A simple way to illustrate these models for a two-person case is the use of a table with the actors assigned to rows and columns, and then differentiating choices they have. When there are only two actors, we get a quadratic table of payoffs as shown. In the following, we will analyze 4 canonical examples of games that shed light on basic structural issues of cooperation.
On this slide, you see our first and simplest example of a game, the so-called coordination game. Here, actors only need to agree on a shared rule to avoid conflicts. And if all of them gain equally, there are no differential outcomes in power. For example, in traffic or the workplace, people might agree on certain rules to manage workflows and improve coordination.
In most cases, however, it is insufficient to analyze single instances of cooperation only, as most forms of cooperation are recurrent. Therefore, very often actors will evaluate outcomes based on their effects on relative power in subsequent rounds. In this case, relative, not absolute payoffs would need to be considered.
This point becomes important in coordination games with unequal outcomes, such as the battle of the sexes, which we show here as our second example, including the relative payoffs in brackets. Think of a workplace where the arrangement benefits everyone, but one person still gains more due to higher productivity, which can impact his status within the organization. If this occurs repeatedly, one party, such as in a marriage, may consistently experience relative losses, even though the overall situation seems positive for both, and eventually exit the cooperation.
Our third example is the prisoner's dilemma. This is a well-known payoff structure that illustrates how cooperation can fail when it comes to utilizing shared resources. A classic example is multiple people having access to a common pasture for grazing cattle. Each person has an incentive to increase her own cattle count to maximize her gains, which is even exacerbated if relative, not absolute gains are focused upon. However, if the pasture is too large for everyone to monitor each other, the total number of cattle may end up being too high, leading to overgrazing and leaving everyone worse off. This example demonstrates that successful cooperation often relies on the creation and enforcement of rules to govern the use of shared resources.
The stag hunt is somewhat similar, but with a key difference. If people successfully cooperate, there are no longer any incentives to deviate individually. This scenario reflects the challenge of coordinating a group hunt, where some members may pursue a large game and others eventually catch it. In such a situation, there may be a lack of trust regarding the effort contributed by everyone, leading some to settle for smaller prey they catch individually. They would do this, although they would lose in relative terms, as indicated in round brackets, as well as in absolute terms, as indicated in the square brackets.
In all these cases, powerful actors could ensure cooperation by imposing sanctions on cheaters. They may foster patterns of specialization in which everyone gains in absolute terms, however, loses in relative terms.
This is a typical pattern of interaction in warfare between different human groups. Stronger parties often take a larger portion of the benefits from cooperating and use their power to ensure cooperation for defense, sometimes at the expense of others. Another example is the division of labor based on gender, where in most societies, men typically hold advantageous positions vis-à-vis women.
How then can we evaluate the efficiency of cooperation? Here, the distinction between the three views, which we have introduced in Chapter 2, is key. In the first-person view, the benchmark is a subjective benefit for one single individual or group. This may be to the detriment of other individuals or groups. But those may adopt the perspective where they subjectively benefit as well, such as in the case of identifying with a godlike king.
An alternative is to adopt a second-person view, where a group agrees on gains for each member, as well as a shared standard of measuring efficiency. However, this view still implies that the group may ignore outcomes for non-members, generating negative externalities on those. For example, the citizens of the Greek polis agreed on a shared idea of communal prosperity, but they also relied on slave labor. A complete view on efficiency requires the third-person perspective, which includes both members and non-members. Only here, a complete internalization of externalities can be achieved.
We can further categorize these differences by focusing on negative externalities. These are costs of cooperation that are passed on to a party without compensation and voluntary agreement. From a first-person perspective, one party may transfer burdens to the cooperating partner, thus increasing its own benefits. For example, most workers may have to bear the costs of commuting to the workplace, while top managers may have a company driver.
Similarly, two parties may cooperate in shifting costs to non-members. For example, plastic wastes of consumer goods industries in rich industrial nations are exported to poor countries, often even illegally, which may entail a competitive advantage for a rich nation in those industries. This extends to nature. Adopting a third-person view, the damage done to animals needs to be included in efficiency judgments as well. Overall, this means that patterns of externalization are determined by structures of power between partners, within groups and non-members. We cannot define measures of efficiency without considering this factor.
This discussion shows that economic measures of efficiency cannot be regarded to be objective, since they depend on the patterns of internalizing externalities. An example is GDP, which, as we know, is mainly based on market prices. However, market prices do not account for externalities. For example, many experts think that the Chinese economic growth in the past was inflated, taking into account its severe cost to the environment. This may even backfire in the form of future GDP losses.
What then can we say about the internalization of externalities from a theoretical perspective? In this context, the famous Coase theorem is mostly presented as stating that absent so-called transaction cost, for example, the cost of negotiating and organizing cooperation, an efficient internalization would take place between all concerned parties, irrespective of the initial allocation of resources.
In reality, however, transaction costs are, of course, always positive, and therefore the initial distribution of rights and power will strongly influence outcomes. A standard example is the pollution of rivers. If factory owners are assigned with an initial, potentially implicit, right to pollute, affected neighbors may face difficulties in rallying against pollution, especially if the factory provides jobs. On the other hand, if the initial assignment favors the neighbors, for example, in the form of environmental regulations, the negotiation outcome may be more beneficial to them.
This brings us to a review of the main insights of this chapter. We first introduced specialization as a fundamental principle of both ecology and the economy, following the principle of comparative advantage, which in turn is based on the equally universal concept of opportunity cost. Specialization, including its market-based forms, entails cooperation. When looking at gains from specialization, the distinction between voluntary and forced exchange is fundamental. In the case of voluntary exchange, which includes market exchange, specialization will imply fulfillment of the Pareto criterion. This does not mean, however, that gains will be equally distributed between the parties.
Specialization can cause asymmetries of power, which we characterized as relations of dependency that result from different degrees of asset specificity emerging from the respective specialization process. Parties may anticipate this, and as a result, gains from specialization may not be exploited fully.
We then turn to game theory and used some canonical games to analyze archetypical situations of strategic interactions as a basis of cooperation. We saw that stable cooperation over time tends to be fragile and partly dependent on whether parties base their decisions on absolute or relative payoffs. In all cases, powerful parties, such as the state, can take the role as enforcer of cooperative solutions and eventually tilt the distribution of gains from specialization to their favor.
We showed that the assessment of efficiency of specialization as well as the internalization of externalities resulting from this specialization depends on which of the views that we introduced in chapter 2, first, second, or third person, is taken. In a third-person view, the measure of efficiency has to take account externalities on non-human actors as well.
We finally introduced the Coase theorem in the context of negotiating the internalization of externalities. In the presence of transaction costs, negotiation outcomes will strongly depend on the initial allocation of rights and the related power asymmetries.
This completes our picture of specialization and cooperation. In the next chapter, We will develop these topics further into a fuller account of production and technological development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.